Okay, welcome everyone to our webinar today, Succession Planning, Drop the Hypo Hopes and Build a Solid Pipeline. I'm Jack Zenger and I'm joined today by my colleague, Joe Folkman. We're also joined by two other of our colleagues. Jill Mancini, a Regional Vice President, will share some ideas and some special offer for all of you at the end of today's webinar. We also are joined by our colleague, Jennifer Lambert, who will be our chat room host today. And we're going to ask you to kind of enter in some things to chat, and she will be kind of carefully scrutinizing all those answers and summarizing what you have responded. So again, we welcome you to what we hope will be an informative and a beneficial webinar. I want to just begin by talking a little bit about my own personal evolution in this regard. My first job out of graduate school was with a large financial institution in Los Angeles. And that organization, we had a little room that we had big plexiglass sheets with all the pictures of the executives on these sheets of plexiglass. And there were pasted some performance evaluations by their superiors, and there were listed 2 or 3 potential candidates from within the organization. And as I recall, that there may have been on occasion some candidates who were outside the organization. So there was a formal process that would be broadly referred to as succession planning. As my career kind of evolved, I was very much involved in the whole development world. And I would read on occasion a little bit about succession planning. But I was struck very recently when I saw the results of a research study conducted by the consulting firm I4CP in conjunction with SHRM. They had surveyed some 500 executives around the globe. Half were in the US and half were abroad. And they were asked about their perceptions of the importance of succession planning. And to my surprise, succession planning was ranked clearly in first place among the top 5 concerns that these executives had. While I was interested, I wasn't surprised by that finding. The second big conclusion, however, of this research was, in answer to the question, does your company organization have a formal succession planning process? 56% of the respondents said no. I was struck by this, and I said, fascinating that these organizations see this as the #1 most important topic of concern for the executives, and yet more than half of them aren't doing anything. How do we explain that? And what might we do to help move the needle a little bit in terms of organizations seeing what are the opportunities, what are the ideal conclusions of a succession planning initiative? So in the spirit of just kind of finding out a little bit, that study was done back in 2008. So it's been 13 years. So I'd like to have you, if you would, reflect on what your organization's approach to succession planning is, not your personal one, but what your organization's doing. So for the 56% of the organizations who aren't doing anything, it would seem like they may be prone to kind of have that first philosophy. We'll cross that bridge when we come to it. We'll hire outside if necessary. We'll do our best to get our people ready, but we'll be pretty casual about this. A second answer could be succession planning is really among our most cost-effective ways to kind of guarantee our long-term future. We'll take this really seriously. And we would invite you not only to respond to the poll, but also, if you would, enter into the chat room any words or comments that would characterize how your organization currently responds to. What's their approach to this whole succession planning topic? And again, Jennifer Lambert will be analyzing those responses in the next few minutes. Let me say that my view of this topic is that it's very much akin to the classic onion phenomenon, that there's many layers. And so today, in today's webinar, we're going to try to peel back some of the layers. Looks like the responses from our group, if you'll kind of flash back to that for a second, looks like the responses were slightly more are doing something in a formalized kind of way, but there's a goodly number of people who are not doing anything formal or actively engaging in a formal process at this time. So in peeling the layer of the onion back a little bit, we have one more poll that I'd like to have you respond to. This poll asks several questions. What is the most accurate description of the, your company's approach right now? Is it an activity that's not discussed frequently? Or are there occasional comments about it? You'll see that there's an escalating kind of level of activity or interest. The third one is that, yes, HR has projected when senior executives will most likely retire. And we've kind of done that exercise of kind of knowing what the timetable is. To a fourth level that would be, succession really is top of mind among our executives, and they personally kind of feel some accountability. And finally, the last item would be that there's a highly effective planning process in place. We're building the needed skills and the knowledge for our potential replacements. We take this really, really seriously. So if you would mind responding, how do you see your current intensity level, I guess I would say, about this topic? And thank you for weighing in. And it looks like that the most frequent one is that there are occasional comments about it, but there's no active initiative underway. Well, this is very helpful information to us. We hope that at the end of the day, that we will help you think about what might you do to help your organization take this a bit more seriously. The next poll that I would like to have you participate in is really kind of looking at your current activities in a new dimension. Maybe it's really kind of a scope dimension. So the first option on this poll is, for those of you who are doing something, that succession planning means this analysis of our expected retirement of our key executives, when he or she will retire, at what's the likely timetable, and what roles are going to be vacant then. The second option would be, it would include option A, but it would be, and we've also gone further and identified potential replacements and the development that they will require in order to be fully prepared. The third item down is both the first two, but involves some succession planning to a broader segment of the organization, that you move down into the middle of the organization and you look at some of the key functional department heads. And so the succession planning effort really broadens in its scope. And the last option is the most intense, broadest scope. It would include all of the three above, but it would include that we do a number of things to really enhance the overall development activities, that we know what, we want to start earlier in people's careers. We will use very powerful learning and development methods so that will greatly increase the likelihood of people truly being prepared. So thank you for weighing in on those four levels that really are addressing your kind of scope. And wonderfully here, the most frequent choice is the last one, that people are taking it, in a broader, very intensive kind of way. Let's now just pause for a moment and go back to that earlier question we'd asked you about your overall kind of attitude toward succession planning. And Jennifer, if you would be so kind as to kind of tell us what emerged
I
from
would
the
love
comments that
to.
were typed into the chat room.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for everyone. I loved how it all came in. And these are kind of the immersion themes, Jack, and I'd love for you to share your thoughts on them. The biggest pieces that were consistently mentioned is that they have nothing really formal. It's more informal and it feels more of like an exercise. It's a check the box kind of attitude versus something that's more built out and really deep within the organization. A lot of people are just getting started. They're probably attending this to get some ideas of what to do and where to go. A lot of people also said they have structure, but it's only at the top and they need to deepen it within the organization and aren't quite sure how to do that. And one thing that was mentioned in a few of them as well is that there's a lot of internal talent, but the talent has underdeveloped skills and they're not quite sure how to skill up and develop the current leaders in the organization.
Hey, thank you very much.
You're
Those are
welcome.
very insightful comments and really very much in keeping with what we would hope that we could address today, that maybe we can move from being a totally kind of informal process to maybe bringing more formality to it. And that it's more than a check the box kind of exercise, that it really is a meaningful activity that will help the long-term pipeline of your organization. I also want to go back then to that original research that I referred to earlier. As noted, the research indicated that succession planning was seen by these executives as being the #1 concern, but the great majority weren't doing it. In addition to that, there were some other fascinating questions. One was, to what degree were these succession planning efforts, those of you who were doing something, to what degree were they effective? And the result was, back in 2008, 14% said that it was a high or very high extent in terms of its effectiveness. 40% said moderate, and 34% said small extent or not at all. In answer to the question of, do your efforts extend down through the entire organization? More than half again said not at all or to a small extent. Only 17% of the respondents at that time said to a high or very high extent. And in answer to the question of, do these succession planning efforts really effectively identify and truly develop these candidates for leadership positions, only 20% said yes to a high extent or a very high extent. 31% said moderate, 41% said not at all or to a small extent. So the picture that I walk away with from that earlier research is that not only were the majority of organizations not doing anything, those that were doing something weren't all that satisfied with the kind of results that they were having. So in our effort to kind of peel back this onion a little bit further, my own view is that succession planning, as I have maybe hopefully matured in my view of what it's all about and what its potential is, that my view is that it's really the opportunity for the organization to answer a handful of really important questions. And among those questions are these that you see on the screen. Who should be involved? How do they get selected? And what does the organization need to do about development? Now, I know that one of the criticisms about consultants is that we love to ask questions, but don't always give answers. And so what I would like to do is to do my best to sort of at least share with you some answers, not the answer. And we don't pretend that it's all the answers, but the answer to the question of those three about who is it, how are they selected? Let me just kind of offer you a couple of thoughts. Let me go back. Let's go back on the previous slide if we can. Who are the potential candidates for these high-level positions and how are they selected? We think that in today's world, it's pretty simple for most organizations to look at their senior most executives and find out when is she going to probably retire. Some organizations have a mandatory retirement age for corporate officers. So when it comes to the C-suite, you've got more predictability. In other cases, there may be a very important manager who isn't under that policy of mandatory retirement. So maybe it's conversations with them about what's their anticipated time of retirement. But the process of at least creating a spreadsheet that lays out what are the likely retirement moments in time, what are the positions that we are going to be really, truly needing to fill, and being able to see that seems to me to be pretty reasonable. And it's more than a check the box process. It's really maybe the beginning step of any kind of a truly effective succession planning initiative. Now, as people begin to think about then, okay, these are the positions that are going to be vacant. Who are the potential candidates in the organization? And as I think back to my earlier experience, we see organizations who not only identify people internally, but they also might identify people on the outside. They may be people in academia, they may be people working for a competitor, but it isn't off limits to say, we think there are some potential replacements for Mary, and here they are, and one of them is really working for our competitor. The third big question is, are we preparing them sufficiently for their future roles? The big, I think, maybe accurate criticism of what many organizations are not doing is that not only are we not making a formal spreadsheet that shows when these retirements are going to happen, but are we doing anything really effective in terms of preparing these replacements to be having the knowledge, having the experience, building the strengths that will enable them to truly be able to fill these roles. And if we're not doing those things currently, then how do we go about doing that? Which brings us then to the second kind of group of questions, and that is, how do we fill this leadership pipeline? And a number of organizations have Hypo programs. These so-called high potential programs have a lot of logic behind them. If we know that there's going to be key vacancies, then would it not make sense to identify those people who are potentially able to fill those vacancies? And do we give them special attention in terms of the experiences that they're having, the formal training that they're receiving, the mentoring, the coaching, the formal courses that we would prepare them to be able to kind of fill those roles? And the question is, should we institute a high potential program that truly identifies and grooms such leaders? Now, Hypo programs are not without their critics. And there are two caveats that we would toss out in terms of just some observations about Hypo programs. One is that how people get selected is pretty important. And I'm going to ask Joe in a moment to kind of talk to you about some research that we've done about Hypo programs. So I want to go back to that previous slide. So one of the pieces of research that we did was to look at 3 of our clients and their Hypo programs. And what we discovered was that if you were to look at 360-degree feedback data as any kind of measure of the true level of effectiveness of these people who had been selected to be part of the company's official Hypo program, what we found was Joe, why don't you step in and kind of describe what you found from that research? What happened?
Well, and I'll show you the data in a few minutes, but 40% of the leaders that they said were high potential, we actually saw them as being below average in terms of leadership effectiveness. That's a long way from high potential, which is supposed to be the top 5%.
Okay, so what we've seen then is that, at least based on, and ours is not an extensive amount of research, but these were three large clients with large hypo pools, and shockingly, this high percent of people who were not even above average in terms of how they were perceived by their colleagues. What causes that to happen? We believe maybe that in some cases, some organizations make the selection process of who is in that hypo pool a decision that's being made by one executive as she looks down into her power base or the people that report to her or to him. They alone make the decision about, oh, is this person a high potential person? And they make that decision. We think that the most effective way to go about that is to have it be a group of people who kind of really weigh the capabilities of the people who are being considered to be members of this high potential group. The second caveat we would toss out to you is that the danger of high potential programs can be that it becomes perceived as an elitist group that you get inducted into in some mysterious manner. There's always the debate about, do you tell people that they are or they are not in this high potential group? And that's a debate that I guess will continue to rage. But we particularly appreciate those organizations who have said to their employee group, hey, if you aspire to kind of higher level positions in the organization, we are very open to self-nominations. And if you want to toss your hat in the ring, we will kind of weigh your capabilities and your commitment along with the people, along with others. So we're fans of Hypo programs. We would, and Joe will talk more about the fact that maybe it's important that we have a very rigorous selection process rather than relying on just one executive saying, oh, I think this person is the right one. Okay, the next observation or the next question that we would have is, how do we improve the overall leadership development efforts? And this obviously is a huge topic, but the point I want to make in this regard is simply this. Succession planning by itself is like being out in a rowboat with only one oar. Simply making the spreadsheet, doing the analysis of when people are going to retire, yeah, that's kind of checking the box. But the real issue is the combination of, yes, this is what's going to happen into the future. Who are the people who are capable and do we believe really could fill these positions? And what are we really doing to prepare them? And this raises several important issues. And I'll just cover them briefly, but I think it's in the spirit of saying it's that the succession planning really ought to always be joined by succession planning and development. And that development is only going to have a sufficient impact when it has a broad scale. That is, if you're a company with 3,000 supervisors, and each year you have 30 of them involved in some development process. Yes, that's commendable, but do we really believe that's going to kind of solve the pipeline problem of the future? There has to be an appreciation of scale and scope if we're going to have leadership development make its dent. We think the issue of starting earlier. When Joe and I wrote the original version of the Extraordinary Leader book, our research showed that that the average participant in one of our development programs was 42 years of age. Guess what's happened in the last 15 years? That average age has gone from 42 to 46. So participants are older. We discovered that there were, in most of our client organizations, as many people 55 years of age and older as there were 30 years of age and younger who were participants in these formal development programs. So I think the whole issue of, scope and beginning earlier in people's careers, if we truly are serious about filling the leadership pipeline, we've got to start at a much earlier point in time. We know that effective leadership development involves creating this culture of feedback whereby people can have coaches, can have mentors, that there will be peer coaching, that there will be, a general climate of feedback where they can learn from one another about how they can be more effective leaders. And we believe that the effectiveness of an overall leadership development effort very much hinges on creating this culture of feedback. And the final thing I'll just mention, which is an obvious one, I think, to many of you on this webinar call, is that development events by themselves often do very little unless they're followed up with some sustainment processes and sustainment tools. And so it's the ongoing webinars and lunches and learns and articles being sent to them and opportunities to have discussions with your manager. It's all these follow-on processes and tools that truly make the big impact. Okay, so a series of questions. The last one is, we think that succession planning needs to involve moving down through the organization and tapping and discovering hidden talent pools. And we submit to you that there are probably two large pools that often get overlooked. You who know us well know that we've been, for the last 5 years, publishing a lot about women and the gender differences between and effectiveness in leadership roles. We know that the current situation is still that there's only 3 or 4% of CEOs are women in Fortune 500 organizations. And yet the workforce itself is probably slightly more women than there are men in most organizations. But we believe that women represent a huge untapped resource. Our research shows that women overall are statistically significantly more effective in the great majority of the leadership competencies that we measure. And so that organizations continue to have such major disparities in the number of women in senior leadership roles is very, very puzzling. And we think that women represent a tremendous pool of talent. There's also the other pool of talent, which is the individual contributors, who often plug along doing their jobs, doing them very, very well. They often have a lot of respect from their colleagues. They often seem to possess a great majority of the qualities necessary that a good leader would have. They just haven't been given the encouragement. Their aspirations have not been raised. And we believe that one of the things that a succession planning effort can accomplish is to help the organization identify who are some of those individual contributors who really are this part of this hidden pool of very talented people inside the organization. All right, moving on. So the overall goal is to identify and prepare leaders to take on challenging new assignments and to generate the kind of results that would propel our organization forward. And now I'm going to turn the baton to Joe, who's going to talk to you about some observations about how we go about doing that. So, Joe?
Jack, thank you very much. And you can tell Jack has thought a lot about the theory and, what gets in the kind of how it should work. What I looked at is this question of, well, what gets in the way? What's going wrong? What keeps organizations from being really effective at this? And we identified 11 different issues that get in the way. And Jack talked about some of them, but we'll start with one that he just talked about. It's that we start too late. It's the wrong time to think about a leader when you desperately need them. You need to start thinking, if you're prepared for a hurricane, before the hurricane arrives, right? And so as you think about that, it's too late. And again, the average age a person becomes a supervisor is around 27. And we found the average age where people get the development they need, 46. What happened in those 19 years in between? And that's an issue. And I think, Jack emphasized this, starting earlier is important, okay? The second thing is this idea, this philosophy is we only need a few good leaders. That if you have really good leaders at the top, the organization will basically run itself. And what I have here is a graphic that shows leaders at different levels: top management, senior management, middle management, and then supervisors. And what you see there is the impact of their skill, leadership effectiveness, and the impact it has on employee engagement. And what's very clear is that if people are highly skilled, they really affect the engagement of their direct reports, right? But it doesn't percolate to others necessarily. I mean, that relationship between the supervisor and the direct reports really happens. And so if you have really good leaders at the top of the organization, they're going to affect the engagement of their direct reports. Let me give you an example of that, because if you have really good top management, the engagement of their direct reports is going to be at the 83rd percentile, right? That's great, but that's only 100 people. If you go down to the next level, it's the 64th percentile. And if you go down to the senior managers, and they're going to affect 1,000 people, and then down at the bottom of the organization, the supervisors, 10,000 people. If you do the math there, engagement for the organization would be at the 27th percentile. Right? So if you think about it, you really need organizations that in that organization, you need great leaders at every level. And if you really try to influence that, and if you didn't influence it perfectly, but if you got more training to the people at different positions, you can see that they'd increase that to the 56th percentile. And that's just an example of we need great leadership at all levels in the organization. It's going to help us. This idea of hidden talent is a big issue, and we think it's really important. Having leaders prepared to take on roles is really increases the probability of success. And leaders are more successful in roles when they have the passion and ability to do that. So your challenge is to discover that hidden talent. And Jack was talking about the difference between women and male and female leaders. And what you're seeing here is that difference, that we did find that on average, women were significantly more effective than men. And now that doesn't mean that every woman was more effective than every man, but it does mean on average, women are a good bet. They tend to be very effective as leaders, and that's what we found in the data. Another thing that I think you need to understand is leadership flows downhill. And one of the interesting things that happens is we did a study. This is 11,000 leaders, 7 different organizations. We looked at those in the top, middle, and bottom of the organization, lower level leaders. And what we found is that leadership kind of went downhill. Top leaders, 73rd, middle, 58th, and then the bottom leaders at the 44th. Now, we got organization 8 in, and when we got organization 8 in, their top leaders weren't at the 73rd. They were actually at the 58th percentile. So as you think about that, where do you think those middle level leaders were? Would they also be at the 53rd? No, they're not at the 53rd. They're down close to the 40th, and then the lower levels. And what you see is that leaders create a ceiling. Senior leaders create a ceiling in the organization. And we've all been in a room where it was short, we had to duck down. Well, the same thing happens in organizations. If the senior leader they create a ceiling, people aren't going to go above that. And, a lot of people say, well, I can be a better leader than my manager. And I go, well, that's possible. But if I look at the data suggests that you're going to be a little bit less effective than your manager is. So leadership flows downhill. And one of the things that often happens is we go to organizations is they say, go fix those people, fix those people. And then I always ask, well, what about you people? What about the senior leaders? Because if the senior leaders aren't leading well, if they're not creating that room at the top, that ceiling, that high ceiling, then the people lower in the organization. So we need to even think about development for the senior people. Another thing that we found in our data is that leadership is contagious. And this idea that, again, people say, well, just because my manager is ineffective doesn't mean I will be. Now, we looked at data. This is from 265 managers, and we connected them with their direct reports, right? So here we have the worst leaders, bottom 10%. The average effectiveness of their direct reports is the 29th percentile. In other words, a poor leader pulled down the effectiveness. But as you look at what happens, if you have a great leader, it pulled up the effectiveness. If there's no effect, you'd be at the 50th percentile. So it pulls up the effectiveness 25 percentile points to the 75th percentile. So leadership's contagious. And what's great about that is if you can develop great leadership, it spreads in the organization. It's contagious, and that's going to have a difference. Another thing that happens is people believe that they know whether they know they're the best judge of their effectiveness. We ask that question, well, how effective are people at identifying their strengths and weaknesses? What we found is that other people, any other rater, any boss, peer, direct report, or other, are twice as accurate at identifying whether you have a strength or a weakness than you are. And, what's perfectly obvious to others is a mystery to ourselves. It's like fish are the last ones to recognize the water they swim in. And that is really affecting people because I've never met someone that says, I know I've got a fatal flaw. They always think, well, I'm okay. I might not be great, but I'm okay. Well, the reality is there's a 30% of the population of your leaders generally that have a fatal flaw. And guess what? They don't know it. They don't see it as a fatal flaw. Now, they might recognize it as, well, I'm not great at that. But they don't realize this is damaging their future. It's affecting them significantly. And when that happens, their average effectiveness is at the 29th percentile. Here's an example of 45% of leaders. They don't have any strengths. Now, they don't have fatal flaws either, but they're sort of in that middle, and nothing really stands out for them. There's an interesting thing that happens when people develop strengths. And as you can see here, one profound strength is going to have a dramatic effect on a leader's ability to be successful. And that's what we can help people do, is we can help people identify and build a strength. And that makes a huge difference. And those are the kinds of leaders that you need in your succession planning. They need to have some profound strengths. The next thing that really is obvious to most people is it takes some time to develop new skills, 18 to 24 months. It doesn't happen immediately. And as you think about that, what we found is poor performers can overcome the fatal flaws. Good performers can really create those profound strengths. Here's what we find in our data. We looked at 4,000 people where we put them through a development process, and we found that over 50% of the leaders made a significant improvement. Those with fatal flaws went from the 18th to the 46th percentile. Those without fatal flaws, average effectiveness started at the 55th percentile, but they actually went up to the top quartile. That leaders can grow, they can learn, they can become better if you let them develop and if you give them the feedback. And this is an example of that in an organization where when we started with them, we had about 10% of their leaders that we called extraordinary. They were at the 90th percentile overall. And that didn't change for a few years, but eventually they got up to 21% of their leaders in the top 10% of leaders. So you can really increase that bench. You can have a set of great leaders. This is the study that Jack was referring to, this Hypo study, where we looked at data from 3 different organizations. And we looked at the 360 data. We found in organization 1, 17% were in the bottom quartile. They were some of the worst leaders. 34% were below average. And then in the second organizations, 13% in the bottom quartile, 27% were below average. In the third organization, only 4.3% and 28% were below average. Now, one of the things that we did in that third organization is we helped the leaders there understand how well they were at selecting their high potentials, how good they were. Are they accurate or were they missing? You know, it's like going to a bowling alley and throwing balls, but having a curtain in front of you. You can't see whether you're getting strikes or not. And that's what, succession planning is like when you don't assess the effectiveness of the leaders that you're putting in the process. Jack, any other observations as you look at this graphic?
No, I think the striking thing about it was that, as Joe mentioned, this third organization was more prone to make the information available to the manager. And the managers had a good sense of the capabilities of their subordinates, and that made a huge difference in terms of not having as many quote mistakes in terms of
and 28% in the top quartile. Yeah, that's great.
Yeah.
One thing that we found about high potentials is they're not perfect. And as we looked at some of the common problems of high potentials, what's keeping them from moving forward? Number 1, lack of strategic perspective. They'd never been in a job where they were required to be strategic. Number 2, communicating powerfully. They were used to sort of sharing information with the team, but they couldn't communicate to a larger group. And when they did, they weren't great at it. Number 3, speed. They were slow. They didn't get things done quickly. Speed makes an incredible difference in terms of a leader's effectiveness. Number 4, the ability to inspire and motivate others. They were good at pushing, but they weren't good at pulling. They weren't good at getting people excited, and they weren't good at sharing the energy and getting people energized. The last thing was a surprise. It was technical, professional expertise. A lot of these leaders were put into different functional roles, and they never took the time to really learn that role well and really become an expert in it. But they still wanted to make all the decisions, so that really put them at a disadvantage. The number 11, and I'll get to that in a minute, but I want to show you what some of our organizations do. They create these heat charts. Now, in a lot of the organizations, we don't ever put the names down. We just put a number or something like that. In this organization, they were very transparent with the data, but I want to show you a few things. As the group of HR leaders looked at this, the first thing they noticed is when you look at the 2 highest performers, one of them was a woman. And actually the woman was a little bit better than the man. And that was fascinating just to see that and to say, gee, we never thought Samantha was one of our best leaders. But boy, look at that data. That's amazing. I like Drew here because when I looked at Drew's profile there, Drew's leader rated him at the 99th percentile, you know, and that's pretty close to walking on water, you know, so that's really a good score. But you notice the peers rated Drew at the 16th percentile and the direct reports at the 34th percentile. Boy, that's a real difference. And so, you know, the leader says this person's great, but the peers don't see it. And the third one that was interesting was Ernest. Ernest was a researcher, and you noticed again the manager rates the Ernest at the 78th percentile. The peers rate Ernest at the 9th percentile. And, you know, they were thinking about promoting Ernest to where he would be managing some of those peers, but he was competing with the peers. Again, what we're trying to do is help Ernest develop. And as the HR audience was able to look at this data and understand the kind of development experience that people need, they started to create a plan for how they were going to give that experience to people and help them develop the new skills. And the number 11 issue is there's something that happens as people move along in the organization, as people get promoted. And, you know, we kind of think that, well, things are going to go along. And leader A is the prototype example of how people think things are going to progress in their career. They start off and they're not very effective, 30th percentile overall. And then on the next profile that's done about 2 years later, they progress. They're about at the 50th percentile. And on the third one, you can see that they max it out. They're at the 90th percentile. They've become a great leader. Okay, so that's person A. Let's look at leader B. Leader B starts off at the 60th percentile and then works on improvement and moves again to the 90th percentile. Things are going great. Guess what? Leader B gets promoted. Look what happens. The scores go down. And we found that happens all the time. Now, all the times I run into leaders and leaders say, I've had my 360. Oh, really? Well, when did you have it? 5 years ago. Has anything changed? And what we find often is that when people get promoted, we find that, you know, a bunch of new problems come into view. And one of the things that happened with this leader B is you can see on practices self-development, they quit asking for feedback when they got in the new job. Why? Well, because they thought, well, I've been promoted. I'm the king of the hill. Well, they weren't. And they weren't doing some things well, and they weren't listening to the direct reports. And so this got their attention. And as you think about this idea of helping people develop, it's not a one and done process. It happens throughout their career. And as you give people a chance to kind of move and be promoted and move along in their career, it's really going to help them. So, Jack, how would you summarize these 11 problems?
You know, let me just share maybe my own personal evolution. I began in my career thinking that succession planning was pretty much a clerical exercise, that it was simply looking at when do people plan to retire and who do we have maybe in the organization that might fill those key, maybe C-suite positions. As I have grown older, I hope my understanding of this opportunity has broadened. I now view the succession planning activity as the heart, the foundation of our whole development process. I think it can be the organizing principle and the organizing force. In that sense, I really agree with the 500 executives who said it is the single most important issue that keeps us awake at night and that we should be concerned about. And so I hope that you have been with us today in this webinar, maybe have had a chance to think a little bit more about how might we make succession planning a much more powerful, much more serious, and probably more formal part of our overall development activities. Joe?
So final thought, Jack?
It's up there. It's up
Well,
there.
you said it.
Yeah, I said it. I said it.
That's a quote. Thoughtful
Okay.
succession planning is the heart and the bedrock of everything we do in leadership development. I like that quote. That's wonderful. Well, let's
Now we
move
turn
on
it back
here.
to Jill. So Jill, it's your big moment here.
Well, thank you. What a great webinar. Such wonderful chatting that went on. And it's clear from your comments that this isn't just about planning for retirement. You're thinking about retention, growth, so this is on your mind. And to help you and your organization with your efforts, because you participated in the webinar, we're offering the opportunity for you to have Joe Folkman analyze data from your organization to help you on your bench strength review. And this could be useful for an executive team, for a high potential cohort, for an intact team, but to give you insights into their strengths, impact, and effectiveness. So if you've got a group that you would like Joe to analyze the data on, and we have 360-degree feedback before October 1st, we're happy to partner with you on that at no charge. And you'll have an opportunity to raise your hand and tell us that you're interested when you do the exit survey that will happen after just the next slide. So Joe, on to the next. We're also giving you an opportunity by doing the exit survey, which you can find at the link that's here on the slide, and will also be plunked into the chat box. By giving us your feedback, you'll be eligible for drawing for 6 copies of the new Extraordinary Leader. And 6 chapters of that new book focus on the leadership pipeline and share ideas. So really the next step is to complete the exit survey. Let us know if you would like us to speak with you. And thank you for joining us today. We look forward to seeing you on the next webinar as well.